And I want to just encourage everyone to check out the Point Reyes bookstore. It really is an extraordinary store. It's become my go-to place for recommendations, and also has a really active and wide-ranging slate of events. This is just one of many, and I think Stephen and Molly, who run it, were the first bookstore to contact the people, the colleagues with Dr. Simard, to set up a bookstore event. And so that gives you a sense of how on the pulse the Point Reyes Books is. And so please buy the book and peruse their amazing curated collection of both fiction and nonfiction. I want to also thank Emergence Magazine, an amazing hub for writing, art, film, audio, an extraordinary place, not just of emergence, but of renewal and of possibility there. So a place where I dip my senses, my creativity, my eyes, my ears, to be renewed and to connect with people in this in these very, very challenging times. Well, Professor Suzanne Simard, what a great pleasure to be in conversation with you today. Your book, which is the topic of our conversation, let me hold it so that the camera actually can grab it here. Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. Available for purchase on through the button below. Just an extraordinary weave of stories from the forest, of stories about your own scientific research, and then events from your own life. And one of the messages that I took from the book is that everything in life is interconnected. And I think the way that you connect ecology and science and biography offers multiple vivid examples of that. And I hope we can dig into both the stories, but also your methods of storytelling here in this conversation. I'm wondering if you could start by offering a reading so we can dive straight into the book with you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, David. It's such an honor to speak with you and meet with you and have this conversation. It's going to be a great deal of fun, I can tell already. So it's my pleasure, and welcome everybody. And I'm just going to read from a few pages of chapter 8 that's called Radioactive. So here we go. With the cages up, we were ready for the moment I'd been planning and waiting for during the past full year, ever since I first put the seedlings into the ground, to see if birch and fir traded carbon, whether they communicated with each other through below-ground networks. It felt like a defining juncture, whether my intuition was right that collaboration in the forest was important to its vitality. And if so, I had a responsibility to stop the madness of the wholesale removal of native plants. Over the top of the first set of tomato cages, we draped the gas-tight bags, as though placing a curtain over a parrot cage, completely covering the individual birch and fir. We sealed the bottom of the bags around the stems of the seedlings and legs of the tomato cages with duct tape, making sure there were no leaks. Immediately before the last strip of duct tape was battened down, Dan reached inside one of the bags and taped a frozen vial of radioactive sodium bicarbonate. He carefully injected lactic acid into the frozen radioactive solution using a large glass syringe inserted into a porthole in the bag. Once he plunged the needle into the portal, the acid slowly dripped into the frozen vial, releasing C14CO2 for the paper birch seedling to absorb through photosynthesis. In the meantime, I was back at the tent, extracting 50 milliliters of C13CO2 from the corncob cylinder into a syringe so I could inject it into the other bag covering the Douglas fir. Sweating so profusely my goggles kept fogging, I waddled from triplet to triplet, making my injections while Dan made his. Mosquitoes and flies swarmed like dust. Dan moved swiftly between the triplets in our lab bench, where we kept the vials of radioactivity frozen in liquid nitrogen. I lagged behind as I extracted each syringe of C13CO2 at the lab bench, then shuffled to the next triplicate. After leaving the seedlings to absorb the labeled carbon dioxide gas for a couple of hours, we vacuumed out any potential excess isotope, and then we pulled off the bags. Whatever traces of gases that might have remained were quickly carried by the gentle breeze into the atmosphere. The bags off, Dan ran back to the lab tent to escape the clouds of bugs. I waddled as fast as I could behind him, zipped the door closed, and tore off my plastic armor. Like a surgeon, Dan peeled off his latex gloves and dropped them into the garbage can of used gear. We stared at each other. "We did it!" I exclaimed. Dan said, "Maybe." We still needed to check the seedlings with the Geiger counter. Right. I pulled my plastic suit and surgical gloves back on, grabbed the Geiger counter, and raced back to the closest triplet. The breeze had picked up, and the leaves of the birch seedlings were whiffling around their twirling petioles, the fir leaning steadily into the air current. Across the lake, storm clouds piling up like inky cap mushrooms. A squirrel ran in front of me and stopped on a stump to watch. I lifted the Geiger counter up to the leaves of the carbon-14 labeled birch. I held my breath. Were they radioactive? If not, then all of our preparations would be for naught. If the donors hadn't absorbed the radioactive carbon dioxide, then we wouldn't know if they could then transmit organic compounds to neighboring fir. Dan appeared next to me, looking anxious. I flicked on the switch. A crackle sang from the wand. Dan's face lit up. The hand on the meter swung hard to the right, showing a high radiation count. "Oh, good. I did it right," Dan said, relieved. "Do you think we'll be able to detect anything in the fir neighbor?" I asked. I doubt it. It's only been a few hours since we started the labeling," he said, trained to be cautious with early results. Based on David Reed's study, it would likely take a few days for the radioactivity to transmit below from the birch to the fir. Even if it did move into a neighbor, the amount would probably be below the detection limits of the Geiger counter, and we'd have to wait for results until we ran the samples at the lab. But what would it hurt to check with the Geiger counter now? We could try to get a reading in advance to see if there might be a hint that the Douglas fir needles held the answers. I calmed myself down. I was sure Dan was right. He knew more about labeling plants than most anyone. But what the heck? It cost nothing to try. I instinctively walked to the neighboring fir and knelt. Dan couldn't help but follow me and lean over my shoulder. We both inhaled the piercing scent of fir needle resin, and for a moment I forgot about the years of difficult work and bouts of frustration. I brushed my hand over the end of the wand to make sure nothing was there to mask the signal. The moment of truth had come. The conductor raised her hands to the orchestra. The ensemble readied their instruments. Tilting my ear towards its stem, I ran the Geiger counter over the fir's needles. My wrist lifted slightly in an upbeat, and my Geiger counter wand crackled faintly as the dial on the meter swung up a tad. Strings and woodwinds, brass and percussion exploded as one, flooding my ears, the movement allegro and intense, concordant and magical. I was enraptured, focused, immersed, and the breeze sifting through the crowns of my little birches and firs and cedars seemed to lift me clear up. I was part of something much greater than myself. I shot a look at Dan. His mouth was frozen open. "Dan," I cried, "did you hear that?" He stared at the Geiger counter. He had wanted with his whole heart for the labeling to work, and what we were hearing from the fir was beyond anything he expected. We were listening to birch communicate with fir.
Spectacular. Thank you.
Thank you.
What a moment. I mean, so this is the study that that wound up on the front cover of Nature, and the study from which many, if thinking about the mother tree, you can think of scientific papers as mother trees as well, sending out many sprouts, much intellectual and emotional energy to others. So this is that moment where you realize that the trees are exchanging carbon here. And what really strikes me is how it's wrapped up in your own story, your own presence in that place. The smell of the resin on the leaves, and the sound, and the bodily sensation, the sweat and the discomfort, and so on. And so you're really bringing this process of science that sounds so often abstracted and cold and just about numbers in rows and columns. Bring it back to life. Is that science is organized human curiosity, and because it's human, it comes with all the senses and all the emotions and so forth. So it's thank you for sharing that moment, both in the book, but now giving voice to it for us here. That seminal moment where, at least for Western science, our imagination could expand. As you mentioned, others, including David Reed, had shown some of these exchanges in the lab, but yours was the first field study to show this exchange of organic matter among trees that then shook the whole understanding of ecology and forestry, and maybe hasn't shaken it quite enough in terms of our practices on the land. I'm wondering if you could unpack that process a little bit more for us, because of course this exchange now, because partly of your work, is now familiar to many people, and yet one of the marvelous things in your book is you show how diverse these connections are. It's not just that trees are connected by fungi and that's the end of the story. Every tree has its own character. There are hundreds of different fungi in the soil, each of which has its own season, its own way of connecting with trees. Some of them don't connect with trees really at all. They're connecting with grasses and other plants. And you say that this diversity matters. Mm-hmm. Can you unpack that and give us a little exposition of some of the diverse ways that trees and fungi are interacting with one another in the forest, and why that matters for well-being?
Yeah, well, that connection, the connection between the trees and the fungi, there's symbiosis, the trees interacting with trees, connecting to each other in myriad ways, not just through fungal networks, but through the air, through microbial networks, from one bird flying to a tree and using the nest of another bird. All of that is about connection. And, we as people, we're connected as well. And I grew up connected to the forest. I grew up in the forest. I was just a kid of the forest, and I grew up in the old growth forests of British Columbia. So that is what I knew, and that was my home. And so that's where my foundation of inquiry is, how I grew up in this world and understanding my place in this forest as just one of the forest. And so, that's what really led me to ask the questions that I did about connections in the wild, because I saw in forestry, which has got a long ways to go to improve its practices, as you mentioned at the beginning. Forestry is about, the practice of forestry is often about disconnecting all those parts. It's about, clear-cut harvesting and planting of trees and brushing out plants that we don't want. And even, in the process, killing a lot of these fungi and bacteria and all the creatures, that diversity you talk about that makes up the forest. And, yes, including, the fungi you talked about, all the myriad of species of fungi. It's true, in an old growth forest, there are literally hundreds of fungi associated even with a single tree. And they all do something different. They have a niche where they occupy different layers of the soil. They bring up nutrients, and then they can connect trees together, whether the same species or even different species. And that connection provides not just wholeness in the forest, but avenues for actual communication. And so, yes, these trees are communicating all the time through these connections, but not just through the below ground ones, but above ground as well. And the important thing here is that, we understand these connections we all are evolved from, ultimately from plants and eukaryotic organisms that move from the ocean to the land. We know in our hearts and our souls that connection is important. And my guess is that anybody who's been in the forest, and probably everybody here has and loves trees, that when you're in the forest, that these connections are absolutely essential to the forest and to us too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the way that through the book you unfold piece by piece this story of interconnection, and how your scientific work and the scientific work of your colleagues and collaborators has revealed step by step the complexity of this connection. I'm wondering if we could take a sort of specific imaginative example to get into that. I'm imagining walking through the old growth forests of British Columbia, maybe hearing a varied thrush, smelling the damp leaf litter and the understory. And there in front of us is just a magnificent Douglas fir. It's a huge tree, maybe 500, maybe 1,000 years old. Mm-hmm. And my untutored human senses would be impressed by the magnificent size of this tree. But you take that understanding of the tree much deeper. And in fact, you call these trees the mother trees, the great giants, the elders of the forest. What should I understand about the role of that tree in the forest as I come across it? How is it relating to the others all around it? Of course, it's casting shade and so forth. And the old view would be, well, it's taking up all the light and the nutrients, and it's the dominant, it's the winner of this competitive struggle for light. And indeed, of course, it has won. You can't be around for 1,000 years without doing some things right. But what else is going on with this magnificent mother tree in the old growth forest?
Yeah, so, I'm not the first person to have studied these old trees, but here's what I've learned that adds to that great, growing body of knowledge of the importance of old trees, of elders in our forest. What I've worked on is what's going on in the soil and below ground. So these immense trees, you're right, they can live to 1,000 years old, some of the oldest Douglas firs, and they're huge, right? They can be 50 or more meters tall, and that's in Canada where it's kind of cold up there, up here. And but below ground, what we know now in studying these trees is there's just as much below ground in terms of biomass, like think of that, as there is above ground. It's like there's a whole tree below ground that you see above ground of the same amount. And so there's all this energy in the crown of those trees, the photosynthetic energy that is taking light and converting it to photosynthetic chemical energy. And a lot of that, 50% of it, ends up in the soil. And it feeds the mycorrhizas, of which, like you said, there are hundreds of species, even on a single tree. In Douglas fir alone, there are thousands of species of mycorrhizal fungi that associate with this tree. And a mycorrhiza is that symbiotic helper kind of fungus where the fungus grows through the soil, picks up nutrients and water, and brings it back to the Douglas fir, which provides photosynthate in this kind of market exchange that gets a trading system. And there are, all these different species, they have different niches. That means that they have different roles in the ecosystem. So some of those fungi are big, thick, fat ones that are really good at forming a pipeline connecting to a neighboring tree and sending water or anything dissolved in water, like nitrogen or amino acids dissolved in water, or messages, information about, the relationship with their neighboring trees, whether they're under stress, whether they're healthy. Other fungi are little fine ones, and they'll go into the little tiny pores in the soil where the soil solution is, and that soil solution is full of ammonium and nitrates and phosphorus and all these goodies that the tree needs. And the fungus grows into those pores and grabs those nutrients. Mm-hmm. And it actually wraps itself also around the soil particles, and that helps them glue them together and create even more soil structure, more pores to hold even more of these nutrients. And still others are deeper soil fungi that are able to access water that's at subsurface, right, way down deep, and bring that water up into the tree and then share it through the network to neighboring trees as well. And so they all have these different roles. That diversity is so important. And as a tree gets older and older, they get more, those fungi get more and more diverse. Just like as we get older, our characters get a little bit funnier and odder. We get a little crazier. Well, those trees are also like, they're really expressing themselves and associating with so many different fungi and organisms. And they really are the linchpins to the forest. And just as an additional thought on the mother trees, they're having this mothering, nurturing role in the forest, because all that connection is also connected to the seedlings growing up around them. And so that results in the regeneration of the forest. They actually feed and nurture the seedlings that are falling, the seed falling around them and then growing up in the understory.
And they're discerning in their choice of which seedlings to encourage and which to connect with. Can you tell us a little more about this? This isn't a sort of a just throw things out there at random. These trees are making sophisticated assessments.
Yes, they're very discerning. They're very sophisticated in their relationships, just like we're sophisticated in our relationships, right? We are about our relationships, how we communicate with each other. Like David and I in our conversation, we're talking to each other. We can see each other's faces. We can be responsive and attuned to each other, which we are. And trees are the same, right? In the forest, they're connecting with different species of trees. They're connecting with species of the same, other Douglas firs, for example. They can even discern which of those trees are of their own seed, which are their siblings, and which are their offspring. And they change their behaviors accordingly. So if their seedlings need a little help, which they do if they're growing up in the understory, they're shaded, they don't have many leaves yet or needles, they can't photosynthesize even to support themselves. And so they get some of that carbon directly from the old trees that they've germinated into the network of those old trees. Also nutrients, phosphorus, other things, but also, I think importantly too, they're able, when those seedlings germinate, when those seeds germinate and the root grows into the soil, they're actually tapping into this ancient legacy. This is a legacy network that has been carried on from generation to generation to generation. And that is the connection. They immediately connect with their ancestors, the past, and those ancestors provide them with nourishment, information, wisdom, and that's what they use then to carry on and lead a healthy life and become a mother tree eventually themselves in the forest.
Wonderful. Yeah, and so just now as we walk in the forest, our imagination is sort of drawn first by our eyes, we're such a visual species, and by our ears, the birds and so forth, but now has to be going below the ground into that dark, rich network. And we've just heard what it is to be in the presence of a master teacher like yourself. I mean, I was listening just raps. I want to take her classes. Can I enroll at UVC and listen? And we can all do that, of course, now through this book. I mean, the book just for the many people tuning in, really, I learned a phenomenal amount from this book, even though I've been reading scientific literature and writing about forests myself for many years now. Just an extraordinary richness that's presented in such delightful prose and through an incredible series of stories. And the narrative is just marvelously done. So thank you, and much admiration to you for that. So I'm going back to our imaginary big tree. Once that tree dies, or is in the process of dying, because of course for trees, and this is something that anyone who's spent time in the forest will know, that boundary between life and death is not quite so clear. That a tree may fall, but it still will be sprouting, and there isn't a particular moment where we can declare the moment. Usually there isn't when we cut with a chainsaw, but even then there are resprouts, and the roots are still alive, often for many years. What is the process of dying in the forest, and what does that teach us about how we might be productive members of the forest community, say if we want to be harvesting wood or clean water from the forest, meeting human needs as well as honoring the forest? What do we need to know about dying?
I think one thing to remember is that the forest is a cycle. It's a cycle of life, and it involves birth and death, and then recovery, and then we are one in part of that cycle of life too. We arose from the ashes of the earth, and we will return to the ashes of the earth, including those forests. So yes, the death in a forest is constant. It goes on all the time. It's part of the natural cycling of nutrients and matter and information. But, in a more literal sense, is a tree kind of, it gets old. It still is very productive. And this is one of the fallacies, I think, or the myths that has been dispelled, or that we're trying to dispel in science, that trees kind of reach a point where they used to be called decadent in the world of forestry, and that point was where they no longer are growing faster, that their rate of growth is kind of leveled off. And that's when a forester says, okay, it's time to get rid of that tree, time to cut it down and turn it into 2x4s. But what we know now is that these old trees are just really getting started, right? This is when they're actually putting on more and more carbon. They continue to pack in carbon to their stems, and they pack in a loads of carbon below ground. So this is when they're the most valuable in terms of carbon sequestration and storage. And at the same time, this is also when the diversity associated with those trees, they're a scaffolding for much diversity. And I mentioned the soil fungi. That's, as the tree gets older and older, the fungi get more diverse. The bird communities get more diverse. The nest webs where birds come and go of different species becomes richer and richer. The epiphytes, the mosses, they all increase in richness. The other thing that is going on is that when a tree, it kind of starts to go, past that point where, there's a point where it starts to spiral down. It goes into this spiral of death, but it's a spiral that's a long, long spiral, and it's very complex, and there's a lot going on, a lot that we don't understand. But here's one of the things that I've studied in my research in my lab is that in stressing trees, and so we've experimentally stressed trees and actually killed trees by pulling off branches and needles and attacking them with worms and pathogens, and we've watched what happens to them. So one of the things that immediately happens is the tree goes into this stress response, just like we do, right? If somebody was to come along and punch you in the face, you would have this immediate reaction, and you'd have this emotional reaction and a biochemical reaction. Your face would go red, and you want to punch that person back. At least I would. And so the trees, they go through these biochemical cascades of transformations. So if there's an herbivore, for example, the jasmonic pathway will be triggered, and it'll create all these biochemical intermediary reactions. The salicylic acid pathway will be triggered. They'll start generating salicylic acid. And what these compounds do is they're defense enzymes, basically. And that helps to defend the tree. But it turns out that at the same time, this tree will pass on these messages, some of these defense signals, to neighboring trees, especially if they're of the same species, and warn them. And then those trees will upregulate their own defenses, produce more defense enzymes, and they will be healthier in the face of that injury. The other thing that goes on is that these old trees, as they're dying, they don't just send signals. They actually disperse a lot of their carbon, about 40%, directly into these neighboring plants. And so instead of that carbon sort of going into the decomposition cycle, where some of it ends up in the atmosphere, some of it ends up feeding the soil food web, some of that, 40%, actually goes directly into neighbors, and especially the kin seedlings that are of their own offspring. So this just demonstrates, right, the cycle of life. It doesn't end when a tree is mature. That elderly stage, the stage of going through maturity and dying eventually, is absolutely crucial to the recovery of the forest and the health and vitality and adaptability of the future generations of trees.
Marvelous. So the elders are taking on this supremely important role, at least in some of these forests, which of course the analogies with human,
absolutely,
how we treat elders in human society, of course, is very striking there. I'm wondering about the role of the young, though, because it's so in our culture now, what we're seeing is that the young are leading, right? So on climate action, on justice, and so forth. Is it the older generation that is leading? Some of the following, but mostly we're seeing young people in the streets, young people standing up saying, no, not on my watch. And I'm wondering how that plays out in the forest. You have a few elder trees incredibly important. But they're relatively few in number. And then you have this great mass of seedlings, but also have trees like birch, which often grows in thickets. And how does this process of sharing, of interconnection play out both ways? What are the young giving to, and maybe this is, I'm completely wrong-headed in asking this question, but what are the young giving to the elder generation, as well as the other way?
Well, that's a really great question. So one of the things, we've discovered in the forest in mapping out what these connections look like below ground is that these old trees, they're like the keystone, they're the hubs of the forest. They are connected to almost everything else. They just have these massive root systems with all these fungi, and they're just like, even from a pure physical point of view, it's hard not to imagine that they would be connected to all else. And including these youngsters, as you say, and they actually convey and transmit information and energy to these youngsters. So the youngsters, I call them youngsters, the seedlings, they get going, right? They're able to establish the root system, establish their needles, and grow up and start to photosynthesize themselves. You could think of, as you raise your children, it's when they're able to go to school. They can leave mama's apron and dad's hand and actually go to school and learn even more from the rest of the forest, the rest of the community. And so eventually, those trees, those seedlings will grow up to become teenagers and then intermediates, and eventually they're the mother trees and the father trees and the elders themselves. And in this process, on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly, seasonal, even years and years, this exchange of information and energy goes back and forth between the elders and the young ones. So in the beginning, like I said, it's mostly one way from the elders to the seedlings, but it doesn't take long before that, that there's a back and forth going on, and within a few years. And then, as the elders start to pass on and they're sending on their energy and wisdom, those young ones are the ones that reap the benefits, obviously, but they're also crucial in carrying on the genes of the elders. And the elders, of course, in their DNA, and as we know in our DNA, that is their imperative, that is their legacy, that is their contribution to the next generations, and that is their ultimate goal, really, if they had a goal, evolutionarily, is to have healthy offspring, to give back to the next generations, to make sure the next generations are okay. And so, yes, they're all working together on this task, and it is a back and forth, and it starts almost right away, just like in our own families and our own elders. As our elders are getting older, they're trying to keep the communities strong. My mother, for example, is still the matriarch of my family, but the grandchildren, now that they're in their 20s, they're bringing her, her food and her groceries and sending her cards. But she is the keeper of the wisdom. So they are all connected, just like in our own families.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it was striking how some of this even changes over a season. I mean, but between elders and youngest, but also between different species. That in the summer, the flow is one way, and in the shoulder seasons, if you like, the spring and the fall, the flow goes another way. So, if we were to map this out, the number of arrows would just be overwhelming, and from just one tiny little patch of forest.
Yes, it's a constant back and forth. And that study you just described is actually the transmission of carbon between two different species, taper birch and Douglas fir, and cedar is also in there. And it changes over the seedlings according to who is more replete. Who's got more will provide more to the neighbor who has less. It's what we call in science, it's a source sink gradient from a purely biochemical point of view, is that those trees that are big and healthy and tall and illuminated and older, they have a high photosynthetic rate, and they have a lot of sucrose in their needles and their phloem, which is that outer ring of tubes where the sugars go down to the roots. It's very high in concentration. And then the seedlings in the understory, or a shaded plant, or one that's just a different species that doesn't photosynthesize as much, is the recipient of that. That's the sink plant. So it goes from this source sink gradient, and that source sink gradient changes over the seedlings, especially between deciduous and coniferous forests, where deciduous trees will be like the source in the summer, but in the spring, before it's leafed out, and in the fall, when the leaves start to senesce, those conifers will be the source instead of the sink. So it is this back and forth, this yin and yang that's going on even between different species.
Right. It encourages us, as you point out, to view the forest not as a collection of individuals, but as a set of relationships, of interconnections. I wonder if we could go into some of your interconnections with the forest. One of the things that I really found very moving and inspiring in the book is the way that you describe going to the forest not only as a research scientist with your curiosity and questions, but as a source of strength and of meaning and wisdom for your own life, both in times of great joy and celebration, and also in the times of profound grief and of life-threatening illness. And so your scientific work took place in the context of a much larger, more comprehensive, multi-layered relationship with the forest. How does science and spirit, and I don't know if you use the word spirit, but the science and spirit work together in your own life? And I realize that's a very big question, and you took 300 pages to walk us through some of the answers to that. But I'm wondering if you could perhaps give us some thought, potentially for people who are asking that question about their own lives, is how do I sort of keep the curiosity, the rationality, and the analytic mind is active, but integrate that with these other ways of being and these other ways of connecting with the forest.
Well, we are spiritual beings. There's no way about. I think anybody who's a human being will know we are spiritual. That's what makes our lives so rich, right? We're human beings with hearts and souls, and we love our neighbors, our families, and we depend on them for lifting us up and helping us through this life, and that's what brings us so much joy. And also in science, we bring our humanness to science, right? Our own spirituality. And in Western science, we've sort of maybe drifted away from that idea for quite a long time now, where Western science has tried to separate man from nature, or that the feeling that the head is different than the body, or there's a good analogy that the mind is superior to the body, that the human is superior to nature, or that we should be dominion over nature, that we're the owners of it, that it's there for us. Well, that gets us into a lot of trouble very quickly. And if you live your life that way, you quickly understand that it leaves a pretty big hole in your heart. And so, in my process of scientific endeavor, I have brought my spirit. I can't help but do that to my research, my history, as a child of the forest and growing up actually in a logging family, and then watching, what the industrial machine was doing to, my forests, or, our forests, the people's forests, was just heartbreaking. And I had to, it was not like I started out when I was 20 and say, I'm going to, save the forest. It was more of a journey of, oh my goodness, what's going on? Oh my goodness, I've got to figure this out. Oh, what are they doing now? Actually they should, they're severing these connections. It really was a journey. It was a mysteries novel just to myself. And ultimately I was able to stumble on, through my perseverance, these connections. And it was really, that was sort of like the key moment for me, is like, this is what we're missing, right? This is where we feel, this is where we feel bad, is when we become disconnected. And, I think this moment in our history of the pandemic and being isolated, and, that we feel this grief, and it's not just grief of being alone. It's also grief for the pandemic, like what is happening to us, what is happening to our planet. It's grief for our environment, because we know that climate change is on us. We're losing species. Those are all grief-stricken things. But, I found, and not just me, we as people of this earth, as descendants of those eukaryotic cells that came out of the ocean, as ultimately all Aboriginal in our own sense, know that we are connected to this planet, and those connections. And I knew this. And when I discovered it, I was like, this is it. this is what we're missing, and this is what this forest industry is not honoring, these connections. And I was also able to work with Aboriginal people in my own country in Canada. And then I went, this is it. They have known for so long, thousands and thousands of years, that this connection is what gives us health and vitality and meaning. And so that is where I said, okay, this is what we need to do. We need to reconnect with the forest. We need to get out there, go connect with your trees and your plants, and then fight like hell for these forests, because these are our life support systems.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I mean, it's so inspiring. And part of that fight is to turn on human curiosity and listen to our tree relatives through many means. Perhaps through direct listening, but mostly through listening through the process of scientific inquiry, which you've done with such success. I'm wondering if we could turn to some of the questions, the Q&A, and I don't want to sort of hog all the time here asking I've got a whole booklet full of questions. But many people from the audience, people tuning in from all over the world, from South America, from Western Europe, from North America, from Asia today. I'm going to just pick, unfortunately, we can't get to all the questions, but perhaps start with a practical question of what should we do to preserve our soils, to preserve mycorrhizal networks, both for the sake of sort of human practical management, for the things that we derive from the soil, but also for their own sake, for the sake of the soil and the living communities that depend on it.
Yeah, well, I think, I think for one, trust your instincts. I'll tell you, just trust your instincts. You know what a healthy system looks like. But what a healthy system in a forest means is good soil and plants. And plants and trees, because they have leaves and chlorophyll, they're able to take our amazing sunlight energy, convert it to chemical energy. And that energy is what drives all the cycles of our lives. The nutrient cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle. Those are all driven ultimately by photosynthesis. And so, when you're thinking about restoring ecosystems or trying to, help your forest recover from some kind of damage or injury or disturbance, that regaining that linkage between photosynthesis and the soil is absolutely essential. So plants providing the energy, that chemical energy that pours into that soil, and it drives what we call a soil food web, which has different trophic levels, just like in the above ground that you've probably heard about in high school or university. There's also trophic levels in the soil. So all these different layers and at the very base of that trophic level are the trees and plants. And as they produce roots and they shed roots and needles, that critters will eat those and munch on those needles, and then they'll eat other needles, and it actually cascades down through this trophic cascades or trophic levels. And in so doing, that's what makes nutrients available for trees to grow. That's what gives the soil structure so that water can filter through it. That's what creates, ultimately that's why we have oxygen in the environment, is because of these cycles. And so, yeah, that part is absolutely essential. The plants and a good healthy soil with a good healthy soil food web are the actual ingredients. And then on top of that, I guess, the diversity of plants that you need to make sure that it's a healthy functioning ecosystem, and diversity in the soil also are really important. Just like in our own communities, like we need a diversity of people to make our lives rich and our countries thrifty and thriving and enjoyable and lovely places to live.
There are several questions that relate. Ask for your thoughts about how that might relate to landscape architecture and also city planning, but also sort of block by block, how to encourage healthy trees in cities, because of course those connections between people and trees and cities are really important.
For sure.
And I know your research is mostly not being based in cities, and so if you want to take a pass on that, but there is a lot of curiosity. There's definitely applications, David. Yes. So yeah, I mean, for a lot of us, the trees that we know are in our boulevard or in our city park or maybe in our backyard, and it's hard to get to a natural forest. But all these processes I'm talking about all exist in those urban environments as well. Trees are still providing the energy for the soil and still cycling,
the soil nutrients and the water, and that makes your urban environment healthy and, cleans the air in your urban environment, especially if there's, automobiles and emissions, then those trees are what are cleaning the air and making it livable to remain livable. And so, I think, in urban environments, you can really work very well to actually improve it, because, the way landscape architecture in urban environments are right now is historically been in North America is based on sort of European model of what parks and boulevards might look like, which are lines of trees of the same species. And often they're planted not in real soil, but in fill or gravel or, really unhealthy soil. And so we kind of set these trees up for all kinds of problems, not having a living soil. All these species, they're all the same, all the trees the same species, they're really vulnerable to attack by insects like the emerald ash borer, or sudden oak death is another interesting one where it can just spread from tree to tree. So maintaining diversity in urban environments is also really important. So good soil, good living plants and trees, and a diversity of them that also are connected, and they can connect, especially if you create good soil environments.
No, that's one. So coming back to the soil and honoring the soil and thinking about the soil, not just the above ground manifestation that we see. For those interested in further reading on the human relationship with trees in the city, I recommend William Logan Bryant's Sproutlands, which just won the Burroughs Medal, a really magnificent story based on great practical wisdom, beautifully written about people and their relationships, but not just in cities, but in a very active way between people and trees.
I think, these urban forests and environments are essential for us as human beings, right? Because, I think 80% of us worldwide now live in these urban environments, and especially during the pandemic, it's hard to get out into nature, but it's actually really essential for your health and your well-being. And I think everybody knows who has, climbed a tree or climbed into a fort or built a fort in a tree or hung from a branch or a swing, knows that connection, that urban forest, those urban trees, that they're essential for us as human beings to be well and good societies as well.
Absolutely. And a matter of justice as well, because trees cool the city, and the distribution of trees within cities is a reflection, at least in the United States, of redlining and various racist policies. And so the relationship between people and trees is also a place for a lot of necessary work in environmental justice, especially as we move into a much warmer world. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I know. It's essential, right? Everybody needs to be lifted up. Whether you're in a lower economic bracket or a high economic bracket, we need to be helping each other out in a big net and bringing us all along. Because if one part of our society is not feeling well, right? If they're stuck inside, there's no trees around them, they're frontline workers maybe, they need, so much support from us, each other, but also from the natural environment. That's what's going to rejuvenate them, all of us, to keep going, to persevere and to keep giving back to society. It behooves all of us to provide healthy urban environments and rural environments too for all segments of society.
Oh, absolutely. So a question here about the how we think about the narrative of what's happening in the forest. This says, an ecologist friend of mine suggests flipping the model and thinking of the fungi hijacking the trees for their purposes. And I think this is an interesting question because it gets at purpose and teleology and meaning, but also the term wood wide web, which is rooted in your work. And it's a term that's wonderful, but I've always felt a little hesitant about it because wood, of course, is about the trees. Whereas the web is trees and bacteria and fungi all working together. Can we think of a forest as these trees as the above ground feeding appendages of the microbial and fungal community, rather than the human-centered perspective, which is think of the trees first, partly because we use them to print books and build houses and so forth, and the soil second. I think partly what you're arguing is thinking as a soil first. as we try to understand the above ground world.
Yeah, it's funny how our human brains work, right? We're looking for order and simplicity and hierarchies, and and we even have hierarchical naming systems. We have hierarchical governments. We have hierarchical societies. But what I found in nature is it's a much flatter hierarchy, right? It's not a hierarchy. It's a connected system. And yes, there are hubs in those systems that are kind of really super important, but there is a sense of community where all matters, right? That the fungi, the trees, we can't put one over the other. People have all long put ourselves above all others, but that's wrong-headed too, because we depend on all these creatures to have healthy lives, and for our own, populations and vitality as well. And so I like to think of it as a system where all are equal. But just to play with your idea a little bit, that what if the fungi are in charge instead of the trees, which is what we automatically imagine because we can see these trees. Well, the fungi do have a lot of agency in this whole system, right? Just as much as the trees, and actually, a fungus that connects different trees together in a mycorrhizal network. It's in its own self-interest to have connections with as many trees and plants as it possibly can, because that's where its source of energy is from. And then let's say one of those trees dies. If it's got like 10 other partners, well, it's still going to get a lot of photosynthate from those other partners. And it can even play a role in saying, you know what, that partner over there is a bit of a cheater, and he's not giving me very much photosynthate back for all this nutrients I'm giving to him. So I'm going to actually cut him off. And I'm going to depend on these other ones that are much more benevolent to me. Right. And so they do have, they have agency in this. They'll cut off those that are the cheaters. Trees too have agency in this. And in fact, in my own research, I have focused a lot on how trees, because I'm a forester and I came at it from a tree point of view. I'm not a mycologist. And so when I did my experiments, I actually manipulated the trees to see what happens if I shade this tree, or what happens if I, water this tree, or what happens if I add nitrogen to this one? What if I injure that one? And every time I do something like that to the trees, it changes the distribution of resources. It changes the dynamic. So the trees definitely are players in this as well, and their relationship to the other trees. So they're always sort of looking for that balance in the whole community. And the fungi are down there also attuned to the whole thing. And they're feeding their nutrients to where they're getting carbon. And the system works, right? It's what we call in science a complex adaptive system, just like our societies are complex adaptive systems.
Right. And they're melodramas, full of cooperation, conflict, sex, death, the whole bit.
The whole thing. Yeah.
It's all there. Buy the book. The link is right down here, everyone. You can read all about it. So, no, I mean, very seriously, the simplified models of ecology that we present in biology textbooks in high school, college, and so forth. I mean, your work and the work of many others sort of blown those up. And that's exciting, because we now go to a forest and realize that, there are so many tensions, but also so many ways that creatures are working together. And so far together that it doesn't even make sense to think about creatures as separate beings. Fungus, tree, Douglas fir. These are names that humans are often, Western scientists coming in with their binomial nomenclature, pinning them, trying to simplify the system with a language that doesn't honor the full complexity. There's several questions about fire. And you mentioned fire some in the book, and of course it's on our minds a lot in North America, because huge swaths of North America were on fire last summer. In the tropics, of course, forest fire is a huge issue. Fire has a strange presence, as some forests are adapted to fire and need fire, and yet climate change is affecting moisture. It's affecting insect populations in a way that is pushing fire into new or realms that we haven't seen in tens or hundreds of thousands of years. What does your work on forest interconnections and on the lives of trees tell us about how we should be confronting these changes and perhaps minimizing the effect of them on the diversity and vitality of forests.
There's much in your question that is so brilliant and interesting. So our forests, most forests in the northern hemisphere, at least, are what we call fire origin forests. That means that they're adapted to fire. They rejuvenate following fire. They depend on fire to maintain their vigor, for regeneration. One of the things that fire does in sort of the California ecosystems, for example, is that they will burn out the understory plants that sort of will start to accumulate over time, and keep those forests more open, more lush. The big old trees that are left behind, and they're quite resistant to fire. If they're good and healthy and they have thick bark, then they will remain behind. And like I said before, they'll lift water up from deep down in the soil layers and maintain a humidity in the forest floor and the understory plants. And so, yes, that's an example of how fire is so essential. In my neck of the woods, fire in the boreal forest is part of how, it's a constant thing, it happens every year. Yes, climate is changing and temperatures are warming, and temperature or precipitation patterns are changing. Some areas are drying out. Some places are getting wetter but having summer droughts. And this all changes what we call the natural fire regime. And so that means that the patterns that have developed and evolved, if you want to call evolution, over the past millennia, they're changing rapidly as climate is changing rapidly. And so sometimes in the boreal, at least in Canada, what we found in British Columbia, where I'm from, we've had some huge mega fire years, which is really scary for people, especially since we've built homes in these areas, we've developed some of these areas. But these big fires, they have a lot of variability, right? They have happened in the past, but we are kind of tipping it into a different balance here. And it gets to, it can, at least in Canada, you can create these tipping points where the fires become so extensive, so severe and the mycorrhizal fungi will get burned up. The seeds, there's not many seed sources. And so then you have a problem, right? And what we need to do as human beings is that when these fires, first of all, we should mitigate the fires by allowing controlled burning so these systems can actually recover as they naturally are supposed to. And then if the fires do get away from us, and burn huge areas. For example, in British Columbia, there were 2.5 million hectares burned over 2 years, just recently. And some of those burns are so huge that they're going to need our help to recover, and we need to help them, right? So what we don't want is for these systems to unravel so that the soils start to erode, they collapse, and then you're basically at what we call primary succession almost in forests. We don't want to get to that point. So replanting these areas or putting seed out them, getting that photosynthetic machinery back in place so that the cycles can start again and help the forest recover is essential. We have a big role to play in that as human beings. The other thing I'm just going to mention here is that the other thing with climate change is that species have got to migrate, right? They cannot keep up with the velocity of warming that is going on this earth. There's no way. And, based on paleoecology records, they've got to migrate 10 times faster than they ever have in the evolutionary history of these plants. They're not going to be able to do that. So as human beings, as part of these ecosystems who have obligations to our Mother Earth and to our future generations, we need to be helping these trees and forests migrate. We need to assist them. We need to be in there and making sure that they regenerate, and so that they can continue to sequester and store carbon and provide clean water and clean out our air as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we do all have a role to play, important, very, very important roles to play in this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that's something that, particularly in many parts of North America, that is just literally coming into our bloodstream as we breathe the smoke. As the forest clouds over the sky, turns the sky yellow, orange, and we're embedded in it. So even though we imagine we're separate from the forest, these fires are a reminder that no, we're not separate, even in the middle of the city. I wanted to ask you, kind of political question here.
Yes.
So your book, it seems to me, is an indictment of a political and industrial system that is based on exploitation, that is based on forgetting the wisdom of the soil, that is based on the exploitation and the thievery, the stealing of land from those who understood the forest the best and still understand the forest the best. What do we need to do collectively in terms of political action, in terms of economic change, to bring human life back into connection with and synergy with the life of the planet, which is, of course, the only kind of life there is. We've become estranged from that, and yet our political systems currently seem unwilling to bend back towards more ecological approaches to life. What would be your diagnosis and challenge to us in terms of political action?
Yeah, those are such huge but super important questions. So what you described is is in the colonization of North America, we've brought Western science, Western values, and we've preempted. And the Aboriginal people that lived here for thousands of years, Haida Gwaii, 14,000 years. And we took over basically Western. I'm a Western, my family originates from France. And we ignored their knowledge, right? For centuries, we're still ignoring that knowledge. To our detriment, right? It's our own folly that we're ignoring this knowledge, because it's based on thousands and thousands of years of working with the land, observing what grows here, what blooms when the fish run, the variability in those cycles, and adapting ourselves to those cycles instead of just like mowing it over because we can, right? Take all the trees just because we can, take all the fish just because we can. No, that's not the way, an intelligent society would work. It would work attuned to these natural cycles. And that is what the Aboriginal people did. And that's why they were so thrifty and wealthy along the West Coast, across all of North America and South America. And, and so we're actually exploiting that wealth. We're exploiting that knowledge. We're mining it, basically. And so what do? We've got to get back to our reason, right? What makes us happy and healthy? Well, what makes us happy and healthy is our connection to each other and to our planet Earth, our environment, our trees, our ecosystems. That's what makes us happy and healthy. And so we can learn so much from those original learnings. We can stop ignoring them and reconnect with them and honor their territorial jurisdictions over their resources. This is going to be this is very difficult because there's been generations and generations of exploitation and oppression, but that doesn't mean it can't be fixed, and it needs to be fixed. And at the same time, not just with the people, but the forest too. So, for example, in British Columbia, where I'm from, on Vancouver Island right now, we have people blockading and chaining themselves to trees because we want to clear cut the last 3% of old growth forests. The last 3%. And this is in First Nations land territories. And they're stuck in between this war in the woods, basically. And we've got to push our politicians to make the right choices to conserve those precious ecosystems, because that's where our future lies, right? Is in our connection to those forests, the genes that have been through multiple generations of climatic change that are going to provide seed for the future. We need to save those, not cut them down and turn them into 2x4s and toilet paper. That's crazy, right? Like, we need to hold our politicians to their feet to the fire, and we need to elect progressive governments that are going to make those hard decisions. And I know I'm starting to rant a little bit, but the other thing that goes hand in hand with that, of course, there's going to be no amount of saving old growth forests if we don't decarbonize our energy sector. So, that swamps out anything that the trees and deforestation does. That contributes like 3/4 of our greenhouse gases. So we have to address that problem too. And I actually feel really hopeful because I see Joe Biden making those hard decisions, and Justin Trudeau is going to follow along, and so will the world. But we need to make those hard steps, those hard decisions, and go hand in hand with that of saving our forests at the same time. That is going to be a solution. Okay, that was a lot of stuff to unpack, but I'm very passionate about this. I
Yeah.
care about everybody. I care about my kids. I care about a healthy future, and we do have solutions in front of us. We just have to have the political will to put them in place.
Absolutely. Thank you for those inspiring words. And I hope Joe Biden is listening. And if he is, keep it up and do more, buddy.
Yeah.
So, Suzanne, thank you so much for your work, your leadership,
Thank you.
for being a scientific and cultural mother tree at a time when the world's need and the forest need has never been more urgent. So thank you. There's a great electronic mycelial network tuned in here, over 1,000 people here learning from you. So thank you. These are strange times. These are not chitinous and woody strands. They're coming through Ethernet cables and so forth. But the connection is real nonetheless. And I want to, on behalf of everyone here, offer my thanks, our thanks for your work, for this magnificent book that summarizes much of that work, and for the way that you're transforming our understanding of the forest. And to everyone who's listening, thank you for being here, whether you're a great-great-grandmother tree or a brother sapling or a daughter seedling. May the dark, rich, mysterious soil sustain us all.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And I just want to say I have my headphones on because we have our little toddler running around the house now. And Suzanne, your concluding point there was just so well taken. And I think everyone in the chat has responded to it. And David, thank you for such an incredible, as usual, you provide such insight and richness of questions. And thank you all. I feel so inspired. I feel ready to go change the world.
Great. Yes.
And for everyone watching, the replay will be available here on Crowdcast almost immediately after we end. And we'll get this up on YouTube and share a link as well. And I'm going to ask Suzanne and David for some reading recommendations after we get done here. So we'll share some reading recommendations as well. A lot of people are asking for those. Suzanne, congratulations on the book. I hope that we get to see you in person in the future. David, so again, thank you both so much. Yeah. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.